Hello and welcome to DesignOS. In this video, we'll discuss what Glassmorphism is, where it came from, what are its uses, if you should use it or not, and of course, how to implement it inside of Figma. If you want to get straight to the implementation inside of Figma, skip to the implementation of Glassmorphism chapter, but we do highly recommend that you watch the entire video to understand the concept and the concept of trends in general inside of UI design. So let's get started. If you'd like to keep up with the trends in web design, you've probably already heard of glassmorphism. It's eye-catching and colorful. It favors transparency and a multi-layered approach. It is designed to resemble a milky glass surface. Just like the many design trends of 2020, like neomorphism, glassmorphism shines bright, but only when applied correctly. To give you a formal definition, glassmorphism is a term used to describe UI design that emphasizes light or dark objects placed on top of colorful backgrounds. A background blur is then placed on the objects, which allows the background to shine through, giving it the impression of frosted glass. Let's take some time to talk about the elements of the glassmorphism aesthetic. First up is transparency. The frosted glass effect is achieved by using background blurs. This adds depth to the UI design and establish verticality. The transparency and blur make the objects look like they are floating in 3D space. Second is a multi-layered approach. This style works best with one or more transparent layers on a bright colorful background. We will see how this works when we implement it. Third is vivid colors. The background color plays an essential role. A dark background may not work very well, so having vivid colors is a must for this effect. Fourth and last, we have subtle light borders on translucent objects. Semi-transparent white borders simulate the edge of a glass and can make objects stand out from the background, as you can see in this example. Now let's talk about why glassmorphism is so popular. Glassmorphism is a modern UI design trend that's steadily been growing in popularity over the course of the past year. Commonly being utilized in web and app designs, it quickly became mainstream. But it isn't necessarily a new idea. The style is heavily influenced by similar concepts that have first been introduced by Apple in 2013 with iOS 7. It re-emerged when Apple brought back the effect with its latest update to the macOS Big Sur in November of 2020. Since 2013, it has also been used in Windows Vista, and it is now part of the Microsoft Fluent design system. Those who remember the switch from iOS 7 and Windows Vista will recall how refreshing it was to view notifications popping up with the blurred items in the background. Microsoft calls this effect the acrylic and uses it on app surfaces to add depth and help establish a visual hierarchy. This style has lived on and developed over the years, and it has reinvented itself with modern fonts, colors, and shapes to keep things fresh and new. You can head over to our Instagram to check out the dribble analysis of this effect, and while you're over there, make sure you follow us for daily tips around UI design. Now, let's talk about how this effect can be achieved inside of Figma. The effect itself is quite easy. There are, however, a couple of things that you must take into account. The first one, as with many card-based layouts, is that the closer the object is to us, the more light it will attract. In this case, it means that our cards are going to be a bit more transparent. To be a bit behind all our text content, we want to start off by creating a fill for a card to be of lower opacity, so something around 50% should do the trick. To get started, I'll go ahead and create a frame inside of Figma, and next what I'll do is create a gradient on the frame itself. If you want to check out gradients that are pre-made, we highly recommend going to a website called uigradients.com, and here as you can see we already have our gradient set up, so I'll just go ahead and copy the hex code and go back to Figma and change my gradient according to the hex code that I just copied. Alright, now that I have my gradient, I'll go ahead and change this purple to a bit more saturation, and let's go ahead and create a card. And now I'll go ahead and set my fill to white and set the opacity to 50%. Make sure you edit the opacity of the fill instead of the layer, because changing the opacity of the layer will not help us apply the effect at all. I'll go ahead and explore this a bit later. So now I can go to effect and change this from drop shadow to background blur and increase the blur to something like 20. And let's reduce the opacity a bit more. Let's change the opacity to something like 30%. And if I go ahead and duplicate this rectangle and move the duplicated rectangle on top of the other one, you'll see what this effect is doing. It's basically blurring the background. Now, if I go ahead and change this fill to 100% and change the layer opacity to 30%, you'll see that the background blur is not really applied. So make sure that you set the opacity of the fill to a lower percentage and not the layer itself. And let's go ahead and also change our gradient a bit. So what I like to do is rotate my gradient according to the artboard and make it diagonal. Make sure that there is one color in the middle and I'll add another color. Let's try to make this a bit more of a red. And yep, right there. So now you can really see what this effect is doing, because we would want some of our colors to be merging into one another while we have a card on top of it. Next thing you would want to do is go ahead and add a stroke. Let's make it white and let's reduce this to, let's say, 50% or maybe a bit less. So yeah, at 20% opacity, 1 pixel stroke makes our design pop out just a bit more. It gives us a bit more of that floating feeling as well. And let's go ahead and add another effect. Make this drop shadow. Make sure it's white. Let's increase the blur. Just the opacity, of course. Yep, that looks much better. Now we can go ahead and start adding elements of our own to our UI design. So let's say this is a card which shows a product. So let's have this as the image of the product. Make sure our spacing is okay. Let's add some text header, and make sure our font is the right one. And let's change this to bold, increase the size, add a subtext. Then a body text describing the. And let's go ahead and make all of our text layers as white, because white looks much better on here than black does. And finally, I'll go ahead and add a CTA button. So that is the basic of Glassmorphism. You can go ahead and experiment with this design a bit more. So you can go ahead and experiment with the gradient a bit more, like adding more colors, as I have added an extra color over here. Make sure the transitions in the gradients are smooth and place your object in the middle. See if it looks good. Alright, now that you know how to implement this effect, let's talk about if you should actually use it in your designs or not. For websites like Dribble, where you can create designs to only share ideas and not really have to worry about the real world implementation in mind, you can go ahead and use Glassmorphism as much as you want without any worry. On the other hand, Glassmorphism does seem like a trend, and that is what it may end up being at the end of the day. It was introduced in Apple's macOS recently, but it was quite subtle in its implementation, so we would not bank our hopes on every single design team rushing into creating their own designs based on this trend. You can use this trend in end products, but make sure to not overuse it and make sure that there is enough contrast in your design that the user can read the text. So, we hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. Leave a like if you learned something new and subscribe for more videos around UI and UX design.